Hello there, it's Silver. This is Visions of Mana, the first mainline entry in the long-running Mana series in a while. This series has technically been going since 1991, so it's cool to have a new major entry. These are action RPGs that are kind of tangentially related to the Final Fantasy games, although only by association, because the first game was called Final Fantasy Adventure in the US, even though it wasn't actually a mainline Final Fantasy game, although there are still some bits of that DNA left over, like for instance, there's a status effect in this game that'll turn you into a Moogle. But the setup this time around is actually really dark, and it gets to some really weird places. So the story here is that it is far in the future of the previous Mana games world, and the sort of multifaceted different dimensions that used to exist are now all one world combined together. And this has caused a strain on the mana of the world to sort of stay supplied. And there's this big, huge tree called the Mana Tree that is pretty famous as a symbol for the series that is doing all the supplying. And the thing is, the mana is sort of running low in this world because of its combined nature. And the tree needs alms every 4 years to keep it supplied. Unfortunately for this world, alms are people. So every 4 years, 8 people from different elemental villages are chosen as alms, which will then go on a pilgrimage to the tree and give their souls to the tree to keep the mana flowing to the rest of the world. But it's shown very early on why this sacrifice is necessary, because if they don't do that, then the elemental villages get completely destroyed and the areas around them rendered uninhabitable for a very long time. Often in kind of creative ways related to their element as well. Like for instance, the moon element, which in this game is basically time, hasn't had an alm in 16 years, and in that case, this basically means that all of the people of that village just disappeared into thin air and sort of repeat their final day as ghosts every eclipse or full moon. And the whole area is just completely uninhabitable and destroyed. And there's also an earth village that suffered a similar fate, where the entire village is now buried in sand, and all of the mining and stuff is basically impossible to do now because everything is all destroyed. And pretty much the entire area surrounding it, is, because of the lack of earth mana, can't grow anything in the soil, so it's all barren. So basically it's set up early on why people are putting up with this 4-year cycle of sacrifice, because the alternative is basically a complete loss of their homes. And the main character in this game is Val. He's a soul guard, which is someone that's chosen to guard the convoy of alms as they make their pilgrimage to the tree and make sure that they arrive there safely. And when I first started the game, what I thought was going to happen with the story was that the main character's love interest would be chosen as the alm, and then suddenly he would have second thoughts about how this whole system works, and it would lead to sort of a system of betrayal to try and take down this system of sacrifice. But I wasn't really giving the game enough credit, because that's not exactly what happens. Without wishing to spoil anything major, she is chosen as the alm, but everyone's happy about it. And in fact, pretty much everywhere you go, everyone sees being an alm as a great honor, and no one is really afraid of it, despite the fact that many of the alms are very young, and there's guaranteed death waiting for them at the end of their journey. But as the plot progresses, it basically turns out that this entire world effectively has Stockholm Syndrome, because everyone is so used to this system, even though it's terrible, that no one really knows any different or any other way to do things, because a lot of people, it turns out, aren't necessarily happy about this setup, but they don't know any other way but without their homes getting permanently destroyed. So the plot mostly focuses around guarding the alms, as well as finding the rest of the alms, because at the start of the game most of them haven't been appointed yet, and you've got to go to each of the villages and do the various rituals that each elemental village does to actually name the next alm. All the while kind of trying to figure out if this system is worth keeping, or if there is an alternative that is in sight, something that you can actually work towards without a ton of destruction. So it's actually a pretty interesting setup, and it has a lot of twists and turns and some pretty serious twists that I was not expecting. I will not be spoiling any of that for you, but there are definitely some moments that I did not see coming, and overall I think it makes a pretty memorable story, because it's sort of bizarre at first how everyone seems so happy to march off to their deaths, but then you kind of figure out why the world is this way and why people feel that it's such an honor, almost with like this religious zeal, and you start to sort of deconstruct this status quo and see if maybe there's a reason it exists this way, and if there may be an alternative. Gameplay-wise, there's quite a lot going on, so you will be going between relatively large villages and sort of hub areas. Each one will act as sort of a story hub, where you will be setting out from there to figure out the next alm, as well as go to various dungeons and field areas around it to explore and do side quests and level up and all that stuff, and then eventually do a big story dungeon with a big boss at the end and move on to the next village. But the really cool sort of main headlining mechanic here is the class system. So you have 5 different characters that you'll eventually be able to play as. You can switch between any of them at will with the D-pad during combat if you want to. You can have 3 of those characters in battle or in the field at any given time, and you can just go to the pause menu whenever you want and switch out whoever. And each character comes with a specific class that is just sort of their normal default appearance, and this determines what weapon they're using as well as their basic combos and stuff. However, as you progress through the story, you'll come across these things called elemental vessels, which are big plot items as well as useful things in exploration and combat and stuff. And these are kind of exactly what they sound like. They're mystical artifacts that contain the essence of a specific element. There are 8 different vessels in the game because there are 8 elements for you to find. And one of the things that you need these vessels for is there's a whole bunch of stuff in the world that you'll need while exploring that you can only interact with once you have the corresponding vessels. So you may get the wind vessel, and it lets you create these big gusts of wind that will push you up to places you couldn't reach previously. Or you may find the moon vessel, and it allows you to slow down time in certain areas to cross raging rivers and stuff like that. So each vessel has its own uses during exploration. But every character also has a slot where you can equip one of these vessels, and when you do, it changes their class, which means each character actually has 8 other classes that they can switch into that are unique to them depending on which vessel they're holding at the time. And each character also has 3 different weapon types, and their 8 classes will use one of these different weapon types. This means that going to a new shop is actually really expensive in this game. When you get to a new village and you want to buy the new updated weapons for each character, that's 3 weapons for 5 characters, so 15 weapons every time you want to do this, so it does get very expensive to keep everyone up to date. But every class has its own weapon type, of course, and its own sort of combos and different ways that it works, as well as a different function for the weapon, usually like a special combo or a charge attack or some sort of extra action that only that class can use with that weapon to give it some extra flavor. And it also has something called the elemental plot, which is kind of like a straight line skill tree. So each character has 8 of these lines, one for each of their classes, and you will get these things called elemental points, EP, and you get them from leveling up or from exploring. There are these crystals that you can interact with as long as you have the corresponding vessel that will give you some, and there are a couple of other ways to get it, as well as these golden clovers you can find that you can convert 1 to 1 clover into 1 point, in order to sort of make up the difference of what you're missing if you need to. And you'll spend these points on this plot to advance each class's capabilities, and each class can learn various active and passive skills that are unique to it. And the cool thing is, once you learn them, then you have them forever. So even if you switch to another class, you can still equip the previous class's active skills and stuff and use them. In combat, you can also use an elemental vessel. They're on cooldowns, and each one has its own cooldown. They're not the same. And when you use them, they all have some sort of specific function that tends to be very powerful. Like the wind vessel is a boomerang, and it will smack enemies and send them up in the air and take a bunch of wind damage over time. And if you're able to sort of smack them back down out of the air, then it'll release a whole bunch of homing wind projectiles that will go around the arena and hit all the other enemies. And they tend to be really strong. And also, when you use one of them like this, you'll get some of these elemental motes, this energy, and eventually you will unlock an extra mana gauge at the left of the screen, that sort of vertical yellow gauge, depending on how far along the plot you are for each character's class. And this allows you to fill up that gauge and then hold the button down that you would normally use to use the vessel, and it will use something called an elemental break, which is like a big fancy attack that affects the entire battlefield for an extended period of time, and are really, really powerful and often useful in big fights where there are lots of enemies and you're getting overwhelmed, or against like bosses and elite enemies and stuff. Every character also has a couple of these slots for these things called ability seeds, and these are pretty cool. They are sometimes passive and sometimes active. They're kind of like materia almost. You just equip them and they give you something. So a lot of them are passive, where you'll equip them and they'll give you some sort of passive benefit, but some of them give you new spells and attacks and stuff too when you equip them. And eventually you'll start finding these items that can expand the number of seed slots that each character has. There are also items like this for every character's elemental plot. plot. They're divided into several segments, and you won't be able to buy every single skill in the line at once. You have to find these items to expand the plot as you go through the game. And all of these items are character specific, so you have to find each character's specific item. You can't use one of them on anyone you want. But what this all means is you have a lot of freedom when it comes to building each character, because you've got 5 characters, each with 3 weapon types, each with 8 classes, and each with a whole bunch of ability slots where you can equip any kind of abilities you want. And then you combine that with the fact that once you learn any class's skills, you get to keep them. This means that eventually, once you get into like the mid and late game, every character will have a very large list of things that they can do, and you can equip whatever combination of them you want to sort of have them play however you'd like for them to play. So this ends up creating a really robust combat system, and it means that just growing your characters is really fun, because there are so many possibilities and so many different things that you can do with them all, so many different skills and spells and weapons and all this stuff. It means that the combat feels highly varied throughout the whole game, and once you get more than like 2 or 3 vessels, you start to see that there's a lot of possibilities for each character. The exploration itself is really solid because the areas tend to be quite large. You will eventually get a mount that allows you to traverse the big open areas much faster, and there's usually a lot of stuff to find in the big open areas, from those crystals to give you points to various treasure chests hidden around the place. Lots of treasure chests, some of them are very well hidden and can have some really good stuff like ability seeds you can't find anywhere else and things like that. There are also these things called core stones that you'll be getting as you defeat monsters. It's related to a power the main character has, and they're sort of like souls, almost like crystallized essences of things. And eventually, once you get a certain ways through the game, you'll be able to trade these core stones for new ability seeds, many of which are exclusive to the system, and some of which require special one-of-a-kind elite enemies or boss core stones that will give you some unique stuff. There are also lots of reasons to come back to previous areas later, and you can fast travel whenever you want to facilitate this. Like, for instance, those elemental crystals, you'll find lots of them you can't interact with at first because you need their corresponding vessel, which you won't have until later in the game, so you'll want to come back later once you get it and sweep through all of these crystals. You'll also find a lot of side quests to do that usually have really good rewards, especially money and new ability seeds and things. There are also often areas that you can't reach at first because you need a later game vessel in order to give you the path to actually reach them, so you might want to return to previous areas for those, as well as these things called elemental areas, which are like challenge arenas basically. Once you have the corresponding vessel, you can activate these areas, which will put you against some really tough monsters in a big arena, and if you're able to defeat them all, then it will give you an elementally specific seed, usually something that empowers that particular element's attacks. And eventually, if you're able to defeat all of one element's areas, there is a greater area which looks like a big tower glowing with that element's colors somewhere in the world, and if you're able to find it, you can do its challenge, which is much harder, but it allows you to use that particular elemental vessel with no cooldown after you beat it, so that's a pretty huge bonus. You'll also frequently find areas with very high-level enemies that you're meant to return to much later in the game. Like, for instance, from the beginning of the game, even when you're like level 10, you'll be coming across these ruins that are kind of off in the distance that will have like level 55 enemies in them, and you're obviously not meant to tackle those when you first find them, but they do become important later. Visually, the game is really gorgeous to look at. It's very pretty. It's got a really nice stylized look that is super colorful and just really well done. Everything has a lot of detail. The environments are very pretty. The character models and stuff have a lot of detail. And because everyone's clothes change every time they do a class change, there's a lot of different appearances for each character and their weapons. And in fact, there's so much care put into these that at any time you can go into the menu and select what you want each character's weapon and clothing to look like based on all of the different ones they've found so far. So if you have a weapon that is really good but you don't like the look of as much, you can still equip it and then change it to look like one of the previous weapons. So you can basically transmog your characters whenever you want, which is cool. But really, it's the environments, I think, where the art is at its best. The environment art is very pretty, and there are some really impressive vistas as you're exploring through the world. And some of the villages have really cool appearances, like the Light Village is a big snowy, icy village with a big aurora in the sky all the time, and a big sort of stone performance theater where people do like ancient plays and stuff, which is pretty cool. There's a lot going on here with the world, and it links into the world being kind of dark in its undertones, but also very pretty and colorful and vibrant in its overtones, so it gives an interesting impression. The music is also really nice, although that's kind of to be expected for this series, you would hope, because generally the music in these games is very good and memorable stuff, and it's good here. A lot of the different town or village themes are really nice and have sort of a chill, bright feel to them, and it gives a sense of sort of hope. I think that's a lot of the music is sort of a hopeful sound. I would describe the soundtrack as a soundtrack that is trying to give you this feeling of something better for the future, a feeling of hope. That's kind of what I get from the overall atmosphere of the music. Overall, I think Visions of Mana is a worthwhile successor to the previous games, which is impressive to me because they're such a long-running venerable franchise that it's kind of difficult to make a sequel to sometimes because different people have a lot of different expectations for what a Mana game is supposed to be. And if you're going to go for like the full 3D experience, then people are going to maybe have some reservations because of how the series has done in the past, but I think this is actually a really good one. I think the overall combat system and character growth and stuff, as well as the exploration and everything, it all adds up to a ton of gameplay. Like, there's a lot here to enjoy. It's also not a grindy game, so its runtime feels like a good amount of hours of solid content and not some hours of solid content and also a whole bunch of grinding. I haven't felt the need to grind ever, although there were still some combats that were a little bit more challenging, so it's not overly easy either. I definitely think it's unfortunate that the main developers of this game pretty much closed up shop right after its release. That's really unfortunate to see, especially because I think the game is great and it definitely deserves a lot of attention. And honestly, it deserves a little bit better than what it's getting. I think it is well received, but it's not selling extremely well, which is kind of unfortunate for such a venerable franchise. But yeah, I highly recommend it if you like action RPGs, if you've liked the previous Mana games, even if you like JRPGs, because it's adjacent to that. There's a lot here to enjoy, and it's a really solid adventure with a pretty interesting story. So I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for Visions of Mana if you wish to check it out yourselves. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.